Hi and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman and today I'm going to be sharing with you part 3 of my beginning quilting class. It has been fun to see how many people have joined me on this class. Many of you have been quilters and you just want a refresher course, and this class is starting out with blocks that are very simple and teaching you quilting techniques that just get more and more complex as we go along. Now, if this is the first video that you've seen of this beginning quilting class, then you'll definitely want to go back to the intro video. And I'm going to link a playlist below, which has the beginning quilting class introduction tutorial, part 1 and part 2. You'll definitely want to watch all of those. The intro video, and actually in each and every one of these, there is in the description box below each of them a PDF with information on the quilt or the block that we're working on for that particular week. And on the intro video, it does have a PDF with all of the fabric requirements, as well as what we'll be working on and when I'm going to be posting that particular video. So make sure you go back to the intro video, watch that, grab the PDF, print it, save it, whatever you plan to do, and then part 1 and part 2, and then come back and watch part 3. In part 1, we learned the rail fence block, a very simple one, a great block to learn, and it's a great block to actually make an entire quilt using this pattern. Wonderful scrap buster. So if you need to get rid of scraps, this is a wonderful way to obtain that and get your scraps used up in a beautiful quilt. Here's another one, and this is the one that we just did last week, and this is a square and a square. A wonderful block. All of these blocks need to be squared up to 9.5 inches when you finish them, and then when they're in the quilt, when they're sewn into the quilt, they will actually finish up at 9 inches in the quilt, but make sure they're all squared up at 9.5 inches. And so today in the PDF, make sure that you grab that. It's in the description box below. Make sure that you print it. On every one of the PDFs, I do give you an overview of the fabric requirements, which also gives you the size of the wall quilt. It's 53 by 41. The block size is finished in the quilt, but it's 9.5 as you finish them when we're working on them. You're also going to have the information on what size squares and rectangles and so forth that you'll need to cut or pull from your stash and cut. Plus, if there is a PDF of templates, I will also include templates for you if that's required. For today's block, it is the double monkey wrench, and we're going to be learning how to sew together triangles, or actually create a half square triangle unit. A half square triangle is something that you use all the time in quilting. So many patterns require that, and I have a fun, speedy way in which we're going to accomplish that today. So I'm going to take you tabletop here in just a second. Make sure you print off your PDF or save it and have that handy as we go through this. So in front of me here, I have a notebook in which I am going to be saving all of my PDFs for this class. I have everything in plastic sleeves, and I would recommend that you do that. It just helps you keep everything together, and you can easily access it as you need it. I do have my new PDF for today's class printed. It is 2 pages. And I'm going to decide what fabrics that I'm going to use. You'll see in the PDF that it indicates we need some light background squares that we're going to be pulling, some dark pink and some medium pinks. And what I've decided that I am going to use today for my dark pink, I'm actually going to use my black, which is part of my colorway that I have chosen. This was my focus fabric. I had talked with you about how to choose fabrics in the introduction. So if you're concerned about how to choose fabrics and how to coordinate things, go back to the intro and take a peek at that, and it will really help you. So I'm going to use this dark fabric as my dark pink. I am going to use, I think I'm going to go ahead and use this focus fabric for my medium pink. And my light background, I will grab this. And I still have some leftovers from my previous blocks that I might be able to actually use. I would ensure that you keep all of your leftover pieces that you've cut in a basket with your fabrics, because you can always make use of these possibly. So make sure you grab those and maintain those close at hand so that they're easily accessible if you can use them for cutting additional pieces. So looking at your sheet, you'll see there of your background fabric, and it's called light blue here because that's what the diagram is using. But my background fabric is this cream or beige color here. So make sure with all of these colors that are listed, substitute or write in the colors that you are using for your quilt, because your background fabric may not be a light blue and your dark fabric may not be a pink and so forth. Write in what you plan to use from your colorway. So for me, I'm going to be using this cream colored fabric here, from which I'm going to cut my light blue background pieces. And I need 2 4-inch squares, and then I need 4 2 by 3.5 inch squares. So what I'm simply going to do, and this piece has already been squared up. It had been squared up from last time, last week when I had used it for the block that I had cut then. So I'm simply lining it up here and down at this line down here. And what I'm going to do, I'm making sure this is even here and here. I'm going to cut a 4-inch strip from this. Actually it's a fat quarter is what this is. So there it is, 4 inches lined up here and down here. So let me stand and cut it. All right, so I have a 4-inch cut. Let me move this out of the way. Now I want to just even up this rough edge over here. I want to make sure that it's all nice and squared up. And there we go. Now it's nice and even. Okay, now I need to cut 2 4-inch squares. So I'm simply going to line up my ruler on the 4-inch, 4-inch. It's all lined up perfectly square. It's folded, so I'm automatically with this one cut, I will have obtained 2 4-inch squares. So I needed those. Now, the next thing that you need, it says here, we need 4 2-inch by 3.5 inch rectangles. Although this is wider than the 3.5 inch, what I'm going to simply do is cut a 2-inch width of fabric strip here. And I've got 2 of them there. I'm going to cut a 2-inch width of fabric strip there. That's extra. Now, what I need to do here with these 4 cuts is to make sure that it's actually 2 by 3.5 inches, because I'm creating rectangles, and that's the size that they need to be. So I'm just simply going to cut off this 1/2 inch, and I will have what I need. Whoops, I missed a thread there. All right, so I have my 4 beige, or in the case of this pattern, light blue background. These are backgrounds for me. The rectangles and the squares, those are cut. Now let's see what else I need. For the dark fabric, I need, again, the same size rectangles that we cut of the light. And that's 2 inches wide by 3.5 inches long, and I need 4 of those. Now this is a fat quarter that I have not used yet, and it needs to be squared up. So I've made sure that the top here, the selvage edges are even here, the fold is even, and now I'm going to cut away this raw edge here that's really uneven so that we get a perfectly square. There we go. Now it's squared up and it's ready for me to make my first cut. I am simply going to cut a 2-inch wide strip from this. All right, now let me move that out of the way. I do want to square up this edge right here. It's a little wonky. Not much, just a little bit. Needs to be trimmed away. There we go. And now what I'm going to do is cut or subcut this 2-inch strip into 3.5 inch sections, and I have it on the fold, so with each cut I'm getting 2 rectangles. There are 2 rectangles. There are 4 rectangles. This is extra. So now I have my 4 rectangles that I need. There we go. So that's all ready to go. Now let's see what else we need. So I've decided I'm going to add this color, this fabric in. It's part of the pieces of my focus fabric, and I want to include it. So it's going to be the center square of this double monkey wrench block. So I need a 3.5 inch square cut from this. So I'm simply going to cut a 3.5 inch strip from this piece of fabric. I have made sure to lay the selve edges even with the fold, and that is even with a line here. And then I need to square up this edge. This edge of the fabric has not yet been squared up. So I need to get it squared up. There we go. Now as I cut the rest of my pieces from this fabric, they will be accurate. So here we go. I need a 3.5 inch square. So I'm simply going to cut a 3.5 inch strip here. I've lined it up on the 3.5 inch line. It's even here. It's even down there. Let's go ahead and cut. Fold this out of the way. And then what I'm going to do with this piece here is remove the selve edge. I do not want to include the selve edge, and that's these end pieces here. They are very tightly woven pieces of the fabric that need to be removed. They should not be a part of your quilts in any way, shape, or form. So remove those. So that's out of the way. Now I'm going to cut, and I only need one 3.5 inch square, so I don't need it cut on the fold. I can save the rest of this for another part of this quilt. So there we go. So we have that. So I'm adding this to my pile of little pieces that I can create, or I can use later. Now the last color of fabric that I need to cut is my pink. So this pink, or the focus fabric, I have actually used it last week. It is on the straight of grain. Always check and make sure each time you make a cut that your fabric is still on the straight of grain. Everything should be lined up beautifully, and that will ensure that every strip that you cut is correct, and that every square that's cut within that strip is on grain and accurate. So all that I need from this are the 4-inch squares that will match these. They'll go with these 2 squares here to make our half square triangle units. And so I only need 2 4-inch squares, but what I'm simply going to do is cut a 4-inch width of fabric strip. I'll only use 2 4-inch squares. However, the rest of this I will save and put it in my pile of strips that I can possibly use next week or for another block that's coming up. So let me go ahead and get that cut. And again, I'm going to remove the selve edge. Here you can see the selve edge is white here, and you can see it on the bottom. You don't see it as much on the top, but it's really important to get that off. That does affect how your quilt will hang and how it lays, and it just really affects your quilt. So remove selve edges. There we go. That is gone. Now I'm going to simply cut 2 squares, and because I have this on the fold, with one cut, I am getting 2 squares. And let me, if I can get them apart. There we go. So now I have what I need. I have a total of 4 4-inch squares. I have 1 3.5 inch square, and I have a total of 8 2-inch by 3.5 inch rectangles. And that's all we need to create our block. So in this class, you're going to learn how to make a half square triangle. And as you look at this, here, I'll give you a close-up. A half square triangle is basically 2 triangles sewn together on the diagonal. And there's a very simple way to do this. So what I have done is I've taken my the 2 different squares, and I've put them right sides together. Whenever you see an RST in quilting directions, that means right sides together. If you ever see a WST, that means wrong sides together. But in this case, we're putting them right sides together. As you can see, I've done that with both of them. And then I've taken a ruler and I have drawn a line, and hopefully this is dark enough that you can see it. I've drawn a line right down the center of one diagonal from corner to corner on each of those units. Then what I'm going to do is simply sew a scant 1/4 of an inch down one side, and I'll put them on my machine, my sewing machine, and I'll do it chain stitch, which means you just do one after another after another. And in this case, there's only 2 of them to accomplish, but we'll sew a 1/4 of an inch, a scant 1/4 of an inch away from that drawn line. We'll continue sewing here, then we'll flip everything, and we'll sew a scant 1/4 of an inch up this side, and continuing up until it's all sewn together. So let me set up my machine here so that you can see that. All right, so I have you here at the machine with me. I have a little, what's called a leader. It's just a scrap of fabric that I've put under my needle and started sewing. That way, as I continue sewing off that scrap of fabric and onto this point, I won't have any issues with it jamming down in the machine. So I recommend doing that. And then what I'm doing is lining up my needle so that it's a scant 1/4 of an inch. And by that I mean about a thread or 2 less than a 1/4 of an inch away from that line. And I'm simply going to sew down next to that line, a scant 1/4 of an inch. And I'm putting the other block in there, lining it up. Okay, so I have now done both of those on one side. I'm flipping it around, as you can see here, and I'm going to start sewing back on the other side of that drawn line. And I'll bring this up to the camera here so that you can see this closely. All right. Let me get rid of my little leader. I'm going to stick my leader back under the needle. All right, can you see how I have sewn a scant 1/4 of an inch on both sides of that drawn line? Now to separate these, what I like to do is simply take a scissors, and I like to cut from stitching line to stitching line. Let me get that out of the way so I can show you what I've done. So I've cut from stitching line to stitching line. I've gotten rid of the dog ear there. That's just excess fabric down in the seam allowance we don't need. And now I'm going to do the same up here. I'm going to cut from stitching line to stitching line. And I've gotten rid of that dog ear. Now I can take it down to my tabletop, and with a rotary cutter and a ruler I can cut directly on that purple line there, and I'll have 2 half square triangle units from 1. So I'll show you that here in just a minute. Let me first of all cut away these dog ears, stitching line to stitching line. Now let me get set up on the tabletop. So both of my units were sewn, and now I can, and I've gotten rid of the dog ears, now I can actually cut on that drawn line, and when you pull them apart you have a half square triangle unit, and you actually have 2 units, 2 half square triangles from each unit that you've sewn together. Isn't that wonderful? So with both of these here I'll have a total of 4, which is what I need for this block. And what you're going to do now is you're going to get this pressed and squared up to 4.5 inches. Now, if you have some kind of a, maybe a clearly perfect slotted trimmer, you would keep your units as triangles to square them up. But if you don't have something like this, then you can certainly just use an OmniGrid. I'm sure you have some sort of a square ruler, maybe a 6.5 or 6-inch ruler of some sort that has a 45-degree line. It's got to have that 45-degree line on it. As long as it has that line, you can use it to square this up. If you have just a square, you'll first of all have to press these units. And by that, I would press the seam allowances to the dark, or if you choose, you could press the seam allowances open. I'm having a hard time. So you could, I'm finger pressing it right now, and then when I take it to the iron, I could press it open. So either way, whatever works best for you, you can press it to the dark or you can press it open. So let me, all right, so since these have been pressed to a certain degree, I'm going to go ahead and trim them. I would recommend that you take them to the iron first and then bring them back and trim them up. This is how you are going to square this up. This has to be a 3.5 inch square. So to make sure that it is a 3.5 inch square, we're going to line up the diagonal line on your ruler with the diagonal line on your unit. There we go. And then we're looking for this 3.5 inch line here. And we can see that this half square triangle unit is just a bit too big. It's coming out at about 3 5/8. So I'm going to start trimming. Let's start here. Get some of this trimmed away. I guess I missed that little corner. I should stand. If I stand, I can actually press harder. For some reason, when I'm seated, I don't press hard enough. All right, so that takes care of that. Now let's flip it around. Again, line up the diagonal line on the seam allowance. Line up the 3.5 inch here, the 3.5 inch here. And we still have a little bit that needs to come away to make sure that this is a perfect 3.5 inch square. Now this half square triangle unit is a perfect 3.5 inch square, and we've used a square ruler to accomplish that. Let me do one more so that you can see how that was done. So here we go. I'm lining it up, and we can see that it's really quite large. I'm going to remove a little bit on these two sides. And then I don't remove all of it on the first two sides just because I might have missed it. I like to just ensure that I have enough. Okay, now I'm on the 3.5 inch line here and here. That's perfect. This line is right on that seam allowance. Now we just have this much to remove and we are good to go. All right, we have two half square triangle units that have been squared up to 3.5 inches. That step is very, very important. If you left this in those blocks or those squares, you would have a really hard time getting your block to go together properly because these pieces would be too large to fit. So make sure that you always square up your half square triangle units. Now I'm going to show you how to use, if you happen to have a clearly perfect slotted trimmer, I'm going to show you how to use this. And you'll keep your half square triangle units as they are, as triangles, to square them up. We're going to line up these units on the 3.5 inch line. So we're using trimmer A, which is the 1/2 inch increments. So I'm going to line up that stitching line on the 3.5 inch increment. I'm going to line it up on the stitching line on the triangle itself. And I will trim away this. Whoops. Okay, there we go. Now the neat thing about these trimmers is that they have these little slots right here that allow you to remove dog ears. So as you see here, it's gotten rid of this excess fabric. And so here we go. Now I can take this and press it. I can either press it toward the darker fabric or I can press it open. Again, I am lining up the 3.5 inch stitching line on the ruler to the 3.5 inch stitching line on the triangle itself. And I am cutting. I need to move this so I'm at a correct angle here. There we go. Now we're going to get rid of the dog ears. And we simply go into that little slot there, get rid of those dog ears, and we're good to go. Now I can press these two, and then we are ready to go on with the rest of the block. So I've laid out the block in the fashion in which it's going to go together. So we've got our half square triangles finished. They're on each corner, and make sure that you align them the way they should be. I've got my pink toward the center, but this is your block. If you want to turn it around so it's like this, that's totally up to you. But I am going to go ahead and do what the pattern shows. So I've got my pinks toward the center. Now what we need to do is create our little rectangle units, and that is using a dark with a light background rectangles and sewing them together. So I'm going to go ahead and just put them together, right sides together, sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to do that on all 4 units, and then I'm going to press the seam allowance to the dark side, and then I'm going to bring them back here and make sure that they square up to 3.5 inches, and then I'll lay them in here, and then we can put the block together. But first I'm going to take all of these to my sewing machine, and I'm simply going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance down one long edge. So I have my units pressed. I pressed toward the dark so that all of that would not show through on the lighter side. And I squared up each one so they're 3.5 inches. And now I can place them in my block in the 3 rows. We're simply going to be putting together a 9 patch, basically is what it is. 3 units by 3 rows here. And again, if you wanted to switch your rectangle units around where the darker side is on the outside, totally up to you. This is your block. Have fun with it. You don't have to do what the pattern says. You could certainly do that if you choose to. I am going to go ahead and do mine as the pattern indicated. And I'm going to sew this together. I'm going to sew this row together first, and then this one, and then this one, and then we'll sew them this way first, and then we'll sew them together in the columns and then the rows. I just came up with another design here. I did flip these half square triangle units so the pinks are on the outside, and that allows all of this lighter fabric to sort of encircle and highlight that center cross, if you will. That's certainly something you can do if you choose to. So have fun. There's no one way that you can put all of these together. Just enjoy yourself as you're putting these blocks together and have fun. This is the way the pattern is showing it going together, but you certainly don't have to put it together this way. I'm going to go ahead and sew this now. I am simply going to place these units on top of one another, so a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to place this one on top of this, continue sewing a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, continue sewing a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. These 2 columns will have been sewn together. Then I'll bring it back to my tabletop, and I will then add this column, and I will throw this on this side, sew it, I'll throw this here, continue sewing, throw this here, continue sewing. And by doing that, I've actually webbed the block together. It will have been webbed with a thread as I've sewn it. And then I'm able to take this entire row then and flip it over and sew that, and then sew the last row. So that's what I'm going to do. When I'm done, I'll bring it back to the tabletop. So I have them webbed together, and they're stitched together right here with a thread. And what I'm going to do right now is simply finger press. I'm going to finger press these seam allowances toward that dark center. I'm going to press these seam allowances toward the dark out that direction. That is going to allow this to nest. These seam allowances are going this way, these seam allowances are going that way. And now I'm going to finger press these seam allowances to go in. And let me show you what that looks like on the back. So these are going in, these are going out, these are going in. Looks like I accidentally got that open there. I think I'm going to fix that so that it lays nicely. So let me quickly fix that. And then once that's fixed, I can take this to the machine, nest my seam allowances, get everything pinned nicely, and sew these 2 rows together, and the 9 patch is ready to go. Let's take a look at how I sewed this. So I have it, these 2 top and middle row are sewn together, as you can see there. And how I did that was I simply nested. And let me see if I can show this to you. So this seam allowance here is going that direction, this seam allowance is going this direction. I am butting them up together so they nest together beautifully. There's no space between them. And hopefully you can see that and feel it. You can actually feel it with your fingers. And then you can pin it so it doesn't move. And I did the same over here. And then you can take it to your machine and sew that 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I say a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm talking like a thread or 2 less than a 1/4 inch. That simply means that it allows for the turn of fabric, so that when you're turning this fabric and pressing it back, it gives you that thread or 2 additional seam that you need in the squares itself or in those rows, so that your block remains the size that it needs to be. So really do practice your 1/4 inch seam allowances. Oftentimes we might think that we are sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance when in fact it's more of a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And when you're doing that, you're basically just eating up too much of your block, and they're not going to go together. You're going to be very, very frustrated. So practice that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and sew this and bring it back to the tabletop. So the block is finished. It's just an adorable block. This is how I've pressed everything. 2 of these long rows were pressed toward the center, and these 2 in here, when I sewed it together, they were pressed out. But this is how I've put it together. So if you wanted to take a look at that, or maybe take a snapshot of how I pressed all of my seams, and then make sure that it gets squared up to 9.5 inches after you've pressed the whole block. And this block is ready to go. So your double monkey wrench is finished. You have now learned how to do the half square triangle units, and that is something that you'll find is very, very popular in many, many quilt patterns that you'll be trying. I'm so glad that you've joined me for today's block. Next week we are going to be learning the flying geese unit, and that is this block right here. So that is another technique that you really need to know as a quilter, because a flying geese unit is something that you'll also find in many, many patterns. And I have some simple ways of making the flying geese. So we'll see you. Actually, it's not next week. It's the 23rd. It's a couple of weeks from now. I will be posting that one. So I look forward to seeing you then. Please go ahead and comment. If you have any questions that you want to pose to me personally, you can certainly go out to my website, quiltingwithlori.com, and go to my contact page there and just email me directly, or you can certainly make comments right here on the YouTube channel. Please, if you do like the content that I'm providing, please make sure that you like and subscribe and share the videos with your friends and with your guilds. It really does help my channel to get out to other viewers just like yourself. And I'm enjoying putting this block together, the quilts together actually, so I look forward to spending more time with each of you, and I look forward to seeing your quilts and your blocks. Please make sure also that you go out to my Facebook group page, and I'll have that link below, and post pictures of your fabrics that you're using, of the blocks that you're creating, and other quilts, any quilts that you are working on. We love to see that. It's always fun to be inspired by other quilters. I'm so glad you all stopped by to make the double monkey wrench quilt block. And make sure you get it squared up to 9.5 inches, and you are ready to get working on the next one, which will be the flying geese block in just a couple of weeks. So until then, happy quilting.